Hello and welcome to the fifth episode of the Right Podcast. I'm Minahil Khan, your host for today, and I have with me Ms. Madiha Ansari. Madiha Ansari is a Fulbright scholar who works across the development spectrum, and she works particularly with children from Kachi Abadis and children associated with the streets. She is the founder of Cities for Children. Cities for Children does some excellent work with street children, and I'd love to know more about it. And I think our audience would also be very keen to know more about the kind of work that you do, what Cities for Children is, and if you could just tell us a bit more about your work, who you are, and your journey over the past few years with street children.
Thank you so much for having me, Minahil. I think the journey with Cities for Children started when I started working with a great network of open-air, non-formal schools catering to street-connected children. And it really helped to understand, this was called the Delinquents school system, and it really helped to understand the challenges that children and families associated with the streets face. It was a bit of a deep dive when it comes to kind of really understanding why it is that children are on the streets, or why it is that the choice between going to work and going to school is really not a straightforward one for a lot of families. So building on that, I studied some things that were related to this as well, and really sort of stepped back to try and articulate what the niche could be when it comes to supporting street-connected children. I did my research around what a useful education could look like for children, specifically from displaced communities in Pakistan. And again, building on that, Cities for Children was set up to protect what is framed as the right to a childhood. So the right to read, to play, and to feel safe. These are simply articulated, but are grounded quite strongly in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And the work that we do is largely around supporting organizations that work with street children or street-connected children to build programs around learning as well as well-being.
This is really interesting, and I'm assuming that there's a lot of work that needs to be done in this regard, because especially with children connected to the streets, like street connected children, we see that they kind of fall within the cracks, and there are lots of development policies that come out of the state as well, but they don't really cater to street children. So it's good to see that there's an organization that works directly with these children. I was doing a bit of research, and I saw that there are 3 different streams in which you work. The Sikho Sikhao Sathi, and there are 2 others as well. So if you could just explain what those are and what how they came about.
Sure. So each of the streams is related to the 3 strands of work that I mentioned. So the right to read, to play, and to feel safe. And each of these strands is pretty interconnected. Each reinforces each other, because happy children learn better, and well-adjusted children learn better and are more likely to stay in school. And also we do try and put in learning objectives when it comes to our play programs. So I'll start with play, because it's my favorite. Again, play is a right. And it's often seen as a luxury and isn't a priority, but there's a lot of evidence to show that play for young children has a huge role to play in terms of developing social-emotional skills, in terms of even developing in terms of brain development. And so some of the programs that we do are called Hasti Basti programs. Through this, we work with universities, train up cohorts of university volunteers to go and deliver these sessions that are designed to build social emotional skills in playful ways. We have, we do some things with crafts, some things with toys, but each session sort of builds off of each other, so that it's not a one-off ad hoc activity, but it's intentional and there's impact at the end of it. The Sikho Sikhao Sati program evolved out of the COVID-19 pandemic, really, because when schools were closed and when sort of, when education suffered this huge shock as well, some of the kids who didn't have access to digital options were these children from communities that we worked with. And we wanted to find ways just to keep them learning through the pandemic, and just make sure that even if that connection wasn't lost, especially because these are kids who are at high risk of dropout already.
Yes.
So through this program, what we do is that we work to train Bade Saathi. We work very closely through partners to train Bade Saathi, who are older children, grades 4, 5, 6, to be teaching Chote Saathi and be giving these learning sessions to Chote Saathi within their communities in safe bubbles and within their neighborhood. So it could just be, kids. It's mostly kids they interact with anyway. Was lockdown doesn't look like it can in those settlements. What we saw was that, I think apart from being, trained to follow COVID-19 SOPs when they went back into their schools and classes, they were washing their hands first thing. The teachers didn't have to kind of push that, but also there were it was a very beautiful bond that was created between the Bade and Chote Saathi, and there was a lot that the Bade Saathi got out of it as well, in terms of leadership, responsibility, and feeling that they could do it. So that's been sort of something that we really loved doing. And then under the safety strand, we work to reinforce positive mental health. And this has included some workshops with teachers, especially around managing behavioral difficulties and learning difficulties, but also, if it's okay to show later on, maybe, or now, we did a little animation around positive caregiving, because so many protection issues came up during COVID-19. So we did a little animation called Maa Nahi Pyar. We made a resource in English and Urdu. And it so happened that it was launched around the time that anti-corporal punishment legislation was being passed and pushed in the capital. So those tied together quite nicely, because legislation is hugely important, and so are the very practical strategies and tools that people can have in place of corporal punishment.
We'd love to see this animation. If you want to share your screen, perhaps you could, and we could play this right now, or if you want to do it later, however suits you better.
Great. So it's a very simple animation, but each frame has a lot of thought behind it. So I'll maybe sort of talk through things a little bit. So it's small, but it's a conversation starter, essentially.
Yeah.
And the resource associated with it has sort of very very practical strategies for parents and caregivers, and easy ones. Because a lot of the time, when we had this conversation with teachers, for example, their response was, "But then what? You know, if agar maan nahi sakte, then what is the alternative? How are kids going to listen?" And again, there's a lot of evidence and research to say that love makes a difference. It matters. And there are ways.
But I think, sorry to cut you, but I think it will require so much unlearning on so many levels, because I think for so many generations now, it's the only way of disciplining children is by hitting them. So, and this is something which comes very natural. I mean, it's one of those natural reactions that you have, and it's literally every time your even, I mean, as a mother, I can say this, that when my child is driving me crazy. I mean, I have a toddler, so there comes a time where I'm like, okay, I really want to spank him, but it takes everything, and I have to completely like unlearn so many of the things that because I'm like, okay, this is the only way to deal with it. But then all the research that I've done over the past years, I have to go back to that and really tell myself. So it's a conversation that you need to have. It's an actual jihad at that time to really get yourself not to react in a manner which is then, as research indicates, detrimental to a child and will not really make any difference in their behavior. If anything, it's only going to cement that kind of behavior.
So you're so right. And I think, so, that moment when the mom enters and there's a pause and it goes to her eyes, that's that moment where she's thinking, okay, there's two directions that I can go in right now. But I think it's just about having that moment, it's just mindfully, just consciously saying, I'm going to pause, take that breath. There's two directions that I can go in. And also that moment where the different consequences are sort of in clouds around the child. I think it's just the idea that violent punishment can just have just such a negative effect on a child's self-esteem, on their future behavior. It's linked to violence in future, as with sort of that individual as the perpetrator. It's a cycle that doesn't end. And for a lot of kids, I don't know if you saw the little running legs on the side in the bubble, but for kids who run away from home, violence in the home is often a big reason.
And it's so traumatic for children to have to go through that. And I think when they are subjected to violence at a very young age, that's something that they learn, and then that's something that they emulate when they're also older. And I really think, because children are so helpless in front of their parents, in front of their teachers, in front of grandparents, and I think this really kind of takes that helplessness and it really drives them further into into this cycle of violence. And so this is a great initiative. I mean, in terms of, looking at it from a very personal level, though, I feel that, there's so much that needs to be talked about in regard to this, because as I said, that there's so much unlearning that needs to be done. Because if you see a mother struggling with something like this, you'll also see people around her telling her that, oh, you're not disciplining your child. If you're not hitting your child, you're not disciplining them. And this is the same for teachers as well. It's like, okay, if you are not hitting your student, you're not doing a good job disciplining them, and that you're spoiling the child. This is usually the narrative around, when you have a stance against violent punishment. But this is a great start, and it's so important. And the video is so impactful. It's very short, but it's very impactful. So this is great. And even your other programs and how you've adapted them to COVID is pretty remarkable. But in relation to that, one of the questions that comes up is that how has COVID impacted children who are living in poverty already? Considering the fact that, now so many households have been driven into economic collapse. Do you see more children now in streets and out of schools? and how is the government responding to this? And now that we're seeing that, there's a lot of focus on a human rights based approach to responding to this pandemic, do you see that in Pakistan, and especially in relation to street children, considering, so many of our social welfare programs? I mean, we have the SARS program, and it's something that's been lauded internationally as well. But then so many of these children are not documented. So how does it reach them? So, if you could just give us a bit of insight on that.
So I think that's huge, Manal. In a word, it doesn't, because so I think you mentioned the SARS program. It's fantastic, and I think it's just sort of, there's so many great elements to it, including one part of it where parents are incentivized to send children to school, especially girls to school. It's a great concept. I think when it comes to street children or street connected children, I think one big thing really is there is honestly not enough conversation and not enough understanding around who they are. So you see them, you see them on the street, and automatically, I think the public has a certain kind of perception around them. A big narrative is they are sent there by, some sort of invisible gang or mafia. A lot of the time, sometimes this may be true, but I think it's really important to understand the story behind that individual child, and the many kinds of identities that child may have. And in Pakistan, there can be sort of these different kinds of ethnic identities also that play a part. There are some who may be, I'll talk about Islamabad, there are some who may be of Afghan origin, and that's a complicated situation. A lot of them have grown up here, but their origin is Afghan. And so I think there's a lot that they need to kind of, the government needs to kind of figure out around that as well. I think it's not an easy question. Then there are kids who may be from families that have been displaced, a long time ago now, by conflict or by floods or by disaster, or they may have experienced repeated displacement, and which is also why their kids' education may have been interrupted, and there's sort of several reasons why those kids might be on the streets. So communities experiencing protracted displacement, and then there are families who might be coming from other provinces, coming from Punjab, rural Punjab, looking for work, and a lot of these communities, as you mentioned, are in extreme urban poverty, made much worse by COVID-19, and with very little guaranteed access to any kinds of rights and services. Because, as you mentioned, a lot of the time they may not have the proper documentation. This puts them at several layers of vulnerability, because then there's no protection. They're sort of vulnerable to harassment. They're vulnerable to exploitation, and a lot of the time, it may be the difficulties that they may face may be legal. So if they're living in a settlement that if they're living in a house that they're paying rent for but isn't formal, then they don't have a legal right to be there. They don't have a legal right to be on that land, and they can be made to move. Now, the question then is, are there certain rights that they deserve as humans? And I would argue yes. I think, and there are certain rights that they're sort of guaranteed by the state, including the right to education. And I think the difficult question there is to understand who they are, where they're coming from, what the challenges are, and how those rights can be extended. So then kind of, to design policies and programs to be able to reach those kids. And I think as far as COVID-19 is concerned, you're right. It's taken a huge toll, especially on families relying on daily wages and daily labor. During lockdown, a large number of families slid really deep into debt. There have been health problems. There have been, it's been a hard time for everybody in the world, but really more so for some. And there has been an increase in the number of people that you see on the streets. And to be honest, that hasn't been taken very well by the public or by anybody. So I think there's a need to kind of understand where people are coming from and come from a place of empathy. And if we don't want to see children on the streets, then to really sort of dig a little deeper in order to be able to reach them and make sure that they are given the support to be in school or wherever else it is that we want them to be.
And going back to the right to education and their access or lack thereof to it, this is something which is a problem for most not just street children, but in a lot of rural areas also we see that there are ghost schools, there are schools which are just not operational. And now with COVID-19, I think schools are the ones that have been hardest hit. Children are the ones who've been hit so hard by it. They've been out of schools for almost more than a year now. And those who are rich, who have access to laptops, who have access to multiple laptops, still are able to acquire education. But many children now, even those who otherwise belong to middle class families, but who only had one laptop at home, now do not have access to education. So this is a serious concern. And I really, I wonder what the government is doing in relation to this, what policies are coming out which kind of ensure that children across the board in Pakistan are given their fundamental right to education, considering this is something that's been added to the constitution now. But at a grassroots level, it seems something, and also because of the pandemic, it just seems something which is not, it has little implementation on ground. So, and I think this is a bigger issue when you look at street children. So what is your take on that in terms of, what the government should do now?
So I think the whole world has struggled, really. I think it's not just Pakistan. I think it's the whole world that has struggled with the phenomena of school closures, massive learning losses, this digital divide. And there haven't been any great answers yet, apart from the fact that I think a lot of people have now realized that the laptop is actually not a substitute for in-person teaching, even sort of privilege, yes, and for learning. And I think we're going to have to sort of be innovative. I think the DSS incentives are a great start, because again, in terms of that difficult choice for families who are experiencing financial trouble, it helps to be able to send kids to school. But I think there's a lot of catching up to do, and I think there's a lot of teachers who deserve to be consulted around this. And I think one thing that I will say is that sort of going back to school, it's okay to, we had a conversation around this earlier, and I think it was, there's so much emphasis on catching up and on exams and on kind of, sort of hitting those same benchmarks. But this is not the world that we were living in 2019 anymore. And so we can't really have the same benchmarks. So I think there's a need to kind of think about that and review that a little bit. And also to be able to give kids the support that they need when they're coming back into schools. And after this year of fear, after this year of chaos, when they're coming back into schools, I think for the next year, it's okay to in the ideal world, we would be able to incorporate an element of teacher training that would enable them to give kids that better sort of that reassurance and that sort of just ease the transition back into education and into schooling, and say, okay, we're here for you. हम सबको साथ लेके चलेंगे. And to be able to understand that, it will be at different levels coming back.
Yeah. And I think a fundamental part of that would also be to include children in making these policies as well. I think consulting them is also so important, because when you're making decisions in their best interests as per the CRC, then it's so important that they should also have a say in it. And this is something that's generally, I think, I don't know if it's a cultural, you could say it's a cultural thing, a societal thing here, that we don't really, we don't talk to our children. We don't ask them, what would you like or what do you want? We consider it, again, a sign of a child that's very spoiled, or parents who are spoiling, or a culture that's spoiling their children if they ask their children what it is that they want. But I think this is such an important, that's such a fundamental component that's missing in our policy making, which especially in relation to children.
Absolutely. And I think also it's a right. Again, Article 12 says that children have a right to be heard in matters concerning them. But also, I think it just makes sense, because if you're making policies for someone, if you're making policies for a street-connected child, then you need to know where that child is coming from, really. And it's not just about what you want, but how can we support you? I think that question is really important to have with children, with their families. How is it that we can help support you to kind of get to the stage, or and I think that will open up a lot of answers.
Yeah. And I think the way we view, especially street-connected children is very one-dimensional. And it's only when you talk to them and when you consult them that you realize that there's so many different aspects that within that community, there's some different communities as well, with different experiences, different needs. And do you think that our policies right now cater to those different needs?
Well, I think complexity is something that is difficult to manage. And I think, we mentioned this before as well, that there is a lack of understanding when it comes to the complexity of those identities and of those situations. It's not easy. It's not easy to open up that conversation. And a lot of the times when you do open up that conversation, it'll be met with a shrug, because, nothing's going to happen. Or kids who have been on the streets, they've had certain experiences, they're independent, they're a lot of the time they're difficult to manage and difficult to deal with, and it will take it will take hard work to be able to sort of work with them even. And there are organizations that have been doing it over a number of years, and I think they should be consulted and brought on board. And also, I think I will say this, that the approach that is often taken towards street children is either as victims or as delinquents. So I think the shift towards viewing them as rights holders is going to take that whole kind of shift in perspective, and instead of saying, okay, they're definitely from a criminal background, we criminalize them, we criminalize their parents. That's not a long-term solution to the actual issues of sort of intergenerational poverty, and also I think just there's a shift in perspective and in narrative that is needed in Pakistan to be able to make policies that will kind of deal with the different kinds of demographics and also the different kinds of needs really of these populations.
So in relation to that, there's General Comment 21, which talks about a rights-based approach towards street children. So could you just explain what that is, what it really means, and what it would be like for a country like Pakistan? Considering, as you said, we're very far from that right now. So it will require, of course, a lot of change in the way we think in our policy making. So yeah, if you could just shed some light on that.
Well, I mean, I think a lot of it is exactly what we've been talking about, that there are some rights that children deserve, no matter who they are, no matter what kind of settlement they're coming from. There are some things that they are entitled to. That includes the right to education. Now, how it is that we give them that right, I think that's something to figure out. How it is that we make that paths easier for them, how it is that we help them to get registered, or give them the sort of incentive to get registered, or for communities that want to be invisible because they're scared of being registered. How do we deal with that? And I think, so the UN General Comment number 21 on children in street situations looks at kids as rights holders, and also kind of pushes governments to think about removing the barriers that they may face, and the sort of even laws that might discriminate against them. And that includes things like vagrancy laws that kind of criminalize children for being in the situation where they may be begging, or maybe sort of on the street doing economic activities for survival. And just sort of on the basis of that, they are actually, it's legally okay to criminalize them. So that in itself may be seen as a discriminatory law. Sorry, you were going to say something?
Yeah, so no, I mean, just speaking of our vagrancy laws, they're discriminatory, and it's also, I think it takes the children away from their parents and from something that they're associated with, and for economic activity that they're really pushed into. They don't really have a choice in all of this. But do we have protocols in place which ensure the best interests of the child, a rights-based approach when we are taking those children away from their parents, or when the law enforcement agents are dealing with those children? Do you think that there is enough sensitization regarding the rights of children, especially in relation to when you see them begging and when you're picking them up for that?
There needs to be more. I mean, I think that definitely needs to be an urgent conversation, and there needs to be more training, more sensitization, more around what will happen to those kids in now and in the long term. Is there enough consultation of the children and their families in terms of what happens to them? By criminalizing them or their parents, are we actually putting them in a situation where they're going to sort of slide further into financial trouble, because the breadwinner is out of the picture? And what is it that we can actually do to deal with the issue? If it really is true that there are sort of criminal networks behind this, then how is it that those networks can be sort of dismantled? And if it is that these kids are being exploited, then how can we remove the situation where they're vulnerable to exploitation? I think these are really important questions. And also just the question of what happens when they're taken into custody, how they are dealt with. All of that is really important, because kids are impressionable. The experiences they have are going to define the rest of their lives and the path that they take. And especially if the children themselves have a criminal record, that's going to be there for life.
Yeah. No, and I think in Pakistan, in addition to the kind of the impact of being juvenile offenders, in addition to that, the problem is that we don't really have the we don't have the infrastructure to ensure that children are safe when they are in custody, or because we talk about separate, like a separate cell for children, we talk about separate courts for children, but we don't really have that in practice. So just them coming into close contact with adults is an issue. And then also the fact that, is it really in the best interest of the child to take them away from their parents? Because the idea is, and the way we view street children is, that their parents are using them, and these are children who are not attached to their parents, and who want to be emancipated from them. But is that really true? And in your interaction with street children, how do you think? I mean, what is your opinion on this? That do children really want to be independent of their parents, or is that something that really does impact them and impact their development?
I mean, I think I will absolutely fight against this idea that just because a mother is poor and has several children, she doesn't love them. I will just, I can't, this doesn't compute. And it's not fair. It's not a fair characterization of that parent. And at the same time, I will say that a lot of children do experience, neglect in the home, even abuse in the home. Poverty is a reality, and violence is often a reality. And if that is true, and we are really saying that we want to protect these children and set up a child protection system, I think in a lot of places, that is an effort that is underway, and is commendable. But I think the important thing is still to do the hard work to find out what's really going on, and to be able to say that these are children that need to be in a protection facility until the time that we can work with the family and work with the parents to be able to bring them back, to be able to reunite them and sort of.
But are we committed enough to do that?
I don't know if we are. I think we can be.
I mean, we should be. And I think, that is the goal that we should aspire to reach. But I really do think that because we have such a one-dimensional approach towards street children, that I really don't think there's that effort to look into every individual family and the complexities of that family. And which is why this issue is so this is such a sensitive issue, because there are those who are being exploited within their homes, but then there are also those who derive comfort from their homes. So you can't have you can't have one rule for all of them. And I think this is just something that's really lacking in the system as we see it right now.
Yeah, and I think also it's important to think about this. If they are going into protection centers, for how long? How many and for how long? Because the scale and the deep-rooted nature of the issue are not going to change until that hard work is done and until that commitment is made to work with children and their families.
And even with these protection centers, I really wonder, because there are the people running these centers, the people working in these centers, sensitized towards the issues relating to children, because there are still instances of abuse, exploitation within protection centers as well. These centers are understaffed. As I said earlier, they lack in infrastructure. The people working there are not fully trained. So this is obviously an issue for children as well. So I think this requires this requires a lot of commitment from the state to ensure that, at every step, children are protected. And the way we look at street children is something that needs to be changed fundamentally. And in this regard, I think it was heartening to see that the Minister of Human Rights also commented on it on the 12th of April, which is the International day for street children. And she reiterated the commitment to ensuring their access to basic rights such as health, education, social protection. But having said that, and it's commendable that this came from the government, but what do you think is happening on ground? Is this commitment reflected in our laws and policies?
I think there's an effort being made, and I think it's a point where there's a lot of potential to figure out what to do with the child protection mechanisms and how it is that those processes are going to be implemented for the next few years, because the legislation is at different stages in different provinces. And I think there were, in that conversation where the minister sort of made the statement, there were a lot of people who are keen to push for change. It was hosted by this MNA, Ms. Mehnaz Akbar Aziz. Historically, there's been coordination between her and between government across sort of lines to bring about legislation against corporal punishment. It is possible again. I think it is possible to come together on issues that everybody can agree on. Everybody can agree are important. And I think if one child is going through a traumatic experience, that's one child too many. And we need to kind of figure out what it is, how it is that we can put those mechanisms in place to better protect them. And that traumatic experience should most definitely not be coming from, especially authorities that are there to protect them.
Yeah. No, but no, I really think that you're absolutely right on this, and I think as long as there's momentum on this internationally within Pakistan, and there's some sort of if we're answerable, if the state is answerable, and there is like there are initiatives like yours, I really think that slowly this is going to be something that we can improve upon. And I really do think that street children at the end of the day are very vulnerable. We call them resilient, but I think resilience is the only choice that they have, unfortunately, in Pakistan. And I really think that we need to rethink how we view them, and we need to rethink how we look at issues relating to them. Whether that's them begging on the streets, how we look at their relationship with their families, and of course, this needs to come from the state. So it's good to see that there is momentum on this, and we look forward to the legislation that will come through in relation to the rights of children and the rights of street children, especially. And I think it's actually really great, the work that you're doing, and how you've adapted your work to COVID-19 as well. So yeah, thank you so much for this, Madiha. And I really enjoyed this conversation with you. I think I had lots of questions before I came into this discussion, but I think it was really organic, and I really liked the fact that there was so much that we were able to cover, and I look forward to doing this again with you soon.
Thank you so much, Manaha. Thank you for your questions and for the conversation.
Thank you so much for taking out the time, and we hope to stay in touch.